11 years ago, his daughter blocked his number. What he did next, no one saw coming. Every single week, for over a decade, he wrote to her. Every single week, the letter came back unopened. She thought she knew the truth about her father. She was wrong. And the proof was sitting in a dusty file cabinet. After everything she learned, after everything she believed, she finally found herself outside his door. But could she go in? Years later, she finally heard his voice again. And nothing would ever be the same.
If you have ever loved someone so much that their silence felt like a knife twisting slowly in your chest, then you already understand what Daniel Carter lived through for 11 long years. Before you keep watching, hit that like button and subscribe to this channel, because this story is about to show you that truth never truly disappears. It only waits for the right moment to knock on the door again. Stay until the end, because what happens in the final 10 minutes of this story will change the way you think about family, forgiveness, and the quiet, unbreakable patience of a father's love. Daniel Carter was 34 years old when his world split into two unequal halves. On one side stood his daughter, Emily, a bright-eyed 6-year-old who used to fall asleep on his chest while he read her the same dinosaur book every single night. On the other side stood a hospital corridor with white walls that smelled like antiseptic and grief, where a doctor with tired eyes told him that his wife, Rachel, had not survived the surgery. Daniel remembered very little from that day except the sound of his own heartbeat pounding in his ears and the small, warm hand of his daughter gripping his fingers, unaware that her mother was never coming home again. Before the grief, before the courtroom battles and the years of silence, there had been simple happiness, the kind that only reveals its full value once it is gone. Daniel and Rachel had married young, in a backyard ceremony with paper lanterns strung between two old oak trees, promising each other a life built on hard work and honesty rather than money or status. Rachel worked as a school teacher, patient and warm, the kind of person who remembered every student's birthday and every neighbor's favorite flower. Daniel had always been the quieter one, more comfortable with his hands buried in an engine than with words. But Rachel used to say that his silence spoke louder than most people's speeches because everything he did for the people he loved. When Emily was born, Daniel cried for the first time in years, holding his daughter in the hospital room and whispering promises he intended to keep for the rest of his life, promises that would later be tested in ways he could never have imagined. In the months that followed Rachel's death, Daniel became both mother and father to Emily. He learned how to braid hair from online videos at 2 in the morning. He learned which stuffed animal had to sit on the left side of the pillow or Emily would not sleep, and he learned to swallow his own grief so that his daughter would never see him break. He worked as a mechanic at a small garage on the edge of town, waking up before sunrise to pack her lunch, drop her at school, and then work grease-stained hours under cars just to keep a roof over their heads. Every evening, no matter how exhausted he was, he sat with Emily at the kitchen table, helping her with homework, listening to her stories about the playground, and reminding her that she was the best thing that had ever happened to him. Rachel's older sister, Diane, lived 2 hours away in the city. She was sharp, ambitious, and had never quite forgiven her sister for marrying a mechanic instead of someone with, in her words, prospects. After Rachel's death, Diane began visiting more often, offering to help with Emily, bringing expensive gifts, and slowly inserting herself into the little family's life. Daniel, drowning in grief and grateful for any support, welcomed her without suspicion. He had no way of knowing that behind her warm smiles, Diane was quietly building a case against him. One designed not out of love for her niece, but out of resentment toward a man she believed did not deserve the modest inheritance and life insurance that Rachel had left behind for Emily's future. Diane began by planting small seeds of doubt. She would casually mention to Emily, then 8 years old, that her father worked too much and did not truly understand what her mother would have wanted for her. She whispered comments about how Daniel spent money carelessly, how he seemed distracted, how he had moved on too quickly from grieving Rachel, even though Daniel had done no such thing. Emily, still a child trying to make sense of losing her mother, absorbed these words like a sponge, unable to recognize the manipulation hiding beneath her aunt's concerned tone. The turning point came when Emily was 10. Diane arranged a summer trip, insisting Emily needed a break. And Daniel, exhausted from work and trusting his sister-in-law's intentions, agreed to let her stay with Diane for 2 weeks. Those 2 weeks became a month, then 2 months. Then Diane began fighting for legal guardianship, presenting fabricated claims to a family court, about Daniel's supposed instability, his long work hours, and even forged financial documents suggesting he had mismanaged the small trust fund left for Emily. Daniel, unable to afford a skilled lawyer and blindsided by the sudden betrayal from a woman he had trusted, fought as hard as he could. But the system moved slowly, and Diane's calculated lies moved fast. During the custody battle, Diane made sure Emily only saw one side of the story. She told her that her father had agreed to let her live with Diane permanently because he could not handle raising her alone. She intercepted letters Daniel wrote to Emily, deleted voicemails he left on the house phone, and coached Emily to believe that her father's persistent calls were signs of him trying to control her rather than signs of a man refusing to let go of his only child. By the time Emily turned 12, worn down by years of subtle manipulation and confused grief, she made a decision that would haunt her family for a decade. She blocked her father's number. Daniel remembered the exact moment he realized what had happened. He had been sitting in his truck outside the garage, phone in hand, trying to call Emily to wish her a happy 12th birthday. The call would not go through. He tried again from a different number. Nothing. He drove 2 hours to Diane's house that same night, standing outside in the rain, begging to see his daughter, only for Diane to threaten him with a restraining order, claiming he was harassing them. Through the window, Daniel caught a glimpse of Emily standing behind her aunt, her face unreadable, and in that moment something inside him quietly broke, though he never let it show. For the next several years, Daniel did not disappear the way Diane had told Emily he would. Every single week, without fail, he wrote Emily a letter. He never knew if she read them, since Diane intercepted most of the mail, but he wrote anyway, describing his days at the garage, sharing memories of her mother, telling her about the small things that reminded him of her laughter. He kept every unopened letter that came back marked "Return to Sender" in a wooden box under his bed, a growing monument to a love that refused to die quietly. He also began recording short voice messages on an old digital recorder, speaking to Emily as though she could hear him, saving each one with the date, promising himself that someday, somehow, she would listen. Meanwhile, Emily grew up in Diane's polished, image-obsessed household, attending an expensive private school, learning to smile for photographs, and slowly becoming someone she barely recognized. Diane controlled every narrative, every memory Emily had of her father, twisting small kindnesses into manipulations and erasing every trace of the warmth that had once defined Daniel's parenting. Yet despite the constant conditioning, Emily could never fully silence a strange, persistent ache in her chest whenever she saw father and daughter laughing together in public, or whenever she found an old photograph of herself as a little girl asleep on her father's shoulder. The years Emily spent growing up under Diane's roof were, on the surface, comfortable in every way money could provide. She attended a private academy with manicured lawns and uniformed students, took horseback riding lessons on weekends, and was paraded at family gatherings as proof that Diane had rescued her niece from a life of hardship. Yet beneath the comfort, Emily often felt like a guest in her own life, a carefully curated version of a girl rather than a person allowed to simply exist. Diane controlled everything, from the friends Emily was permitted to keep to the subjects she was encouraged to study, steering her firmly away from anything that involved investigation, law, or journalism, though Emily never understood why until much later. Whenever Emily asked about her father, Diane would sigh dramatically and remind her how much better off they both were. How a man who chose grease-stained coveralls over his own daughter did not deserve another thought, and slowly, painfully, Emily learned to stop asking. Still, there were cracks in the narrative that Emily could never quite explain away, even as a teenager. She remembered faintly the warmth of being carried on her father's shoulders, a memory Diane insisted was simply a dream since, according to her, Daniel had rarely spent time with Emily at all. She remembered the smell of motor oil and peppermint, a scent she could never place until years later, when she stood in her father's garage, and it hit her all at once. Small inconsistencies nagged at her throughout high school, especially during the rare occasions she overheard hushed, tense phone calls Diane would end abruptly the moment Emily entered the room. On her 16th birthday, a strange, unmarked envelope arrived at the house, and though Emily never saw its contents, she noticed Diane's hands trembling as she shoved it deep into a locked drawer in her study, a drawer Emily was never allowed to open. By the time she left for university, Emily had grown into a sharp, observant young woman with an unexplainable pull towards stories of hidden truths and buried secrets, drawn instinctively to journalism without ever consciously connecting it to the unanswered questions of her own childhood. Her professors often praised her instinct for noticing what others overlooked, her refusal to accept a story at face value until she had checked it from every angle, a skill that would soon turn inward toward the very family history she had spent years being told not to question. It was during her second year of university studying journalism that Emily first began to feel the cracks in the story she had been told her entire life. A professor had assigned a personal investigative project, encouraging students to research a topic tied to their own family history. On a whim, mostly out of curiosity rather than any desire to reconnect, Emily decided to look into the custody case that had separated her from her father. What she expected to find was confirmation of everything Diane had always told her. What she actually found shattered the foundation of everything she believed. Digging through old court records at the local county archive, Emily discovered documents she had never known existed, financial statements showing that the trust fund Diane had accused Daniel of mismanaging had, in reality, been steadily managed and left largely untouched, exactly as Rachel had intended, until Diane herself began withdrawing significant amounts under the guise of Emily's education expenses. Emily's hands trembled as she cross-referenced dates, realizing that many of these withdrawals occurred not for tuition or necessities, but for renovations to Diane's home and lavish personal purchases. Unsettled but not yet ready to accept the full truth, Emily reached out to a former court-appointed social worker who had been involved in the original custody hearing, a woman named Patricia who had since retired. Patricia agreed to meet Emily at a quiet coffee shop, and what she revealed left Emily speechless. Patricia recalled how Daniel had shown up to every single hearing, exhausted from work but immaculately prepared, fighting desperately for shared custody while Diane had presented polished, seemingly credible evidence that, in hindsight, Patricia admitted had always felt slightly too convenient, too perfectly timed. Patricia confessed that she had always harbored quiet doubts about the case but had lacked the concrete proof to challenge it at the time. That night, Emily returned to her small apartment and sat in silence for hours, staring at an old family photograph she had kept hidden in the bottom of a drawer for years. A photograph of herself as a little girl, laughing on her father's shoulders at a county fair, her mother standing beside them, alive and smiling. The image did not match the story she had been told about a father who abandoned her by choice. A dangerous, aching curiosity took hold of her, and for the first time in over a decade, Emily found herself desperately wanting to know the truth, no matter how much it might cost her. Emily's investigation deepened over the following weeks. She tracked down Daniel's old address through public property records, discovering he still lived in the same modest house on the edge of town where she had spent her early childhood. She learned, through a mutual family friend she cautiously reconnected with, that Daniel had never remarried, had never stopped asking about her, and had spent years quietly donating to the local children's hospital in Rachel's memory every year on the anniversary of her death. Every new piece of information chipped away at the version of her father that Diane had constructed brick by brick, replacing it with the outline of a man who had never truly left. The confrontation with Diane came sooner than Emily expected. During a tense family dinner, Emily calmly laid out the financial documents she had gathered, watching her aunt's confident expression falter for the first time in her life. Diane initially attempted to deflect, accusing Emily of being manipulated by a man who abandoned her, but Emily, now armed with facts rather than childhood fear, refused to back down. She revealed the intercepted letters she had finally uncovered in a storage unit Diane had forgotten to fully clear out. Hundreds of unopened envelopes addressed to her in her father's handwriting, spanning over a decade, each one a silent testament to a love that had never wavered despite years of forced silence. Overwhelmed by a mixture of grief, betrayal, and burning anger, Emily left Diane's house that night and drove for 2 hours without fully deciding where she was going, until she found herself parked outside the small mechanic's garage where her father still worked. Through the window, she saw him, older now, grayer at the temples, wiping grease from his hands with a rag, laughing quietly with a co-worker as he closed up for the evening, unaware that the daughter he had spent 11 years fighting for was sitting just outside, paralyzed between fear and longing. Emily did not go inside that night. Instead, she sat in her car for nearly an hour, finally opening the box of letters she had taken from the storage unit, reading them one after another under the dim glow of her phone flashlight. She read about her father's exhaustion after long shifts, his quiet fear that she might grow up thinking he never loved her, his memories of her mother that he wanted her to know, even if she never spoke to him again. She read the last letter in the box, dated just 3 months earlier, in which Daniel wrote that even if she never forgave him for whatever lies she had been told, he wanted her to know that not a single day had passed where he had not thought of her, and that his door, his heart, and his phone line, though blocked, remained open forever. It was that final letter that broke something loose inside Emily. Not resentment, but a flood of grief for all the years stolen from both of them. With trembling hands, she pulled out her phone and, for the first time in 11 years, unblocked her father's number. She stared at the screen for a long time before finally pressing call, her heart pounding so violently she could barely breathe. Daniel was locking up the garage when his phone rang, an unfamiliar number flashing across the screen. He almost let it go to voicemail, assuming it was a wrong number, but something made him answer. When Emily's voice came through, shaking and barely above a whisper, saying only, "Dad, it's me," Daniel dropped to his knees right there in the parking lot, the phone pressed so hard against his ear it hurt, tears streaming down his face as 11 years of silence finally shattered into a single trembling sentence. They talked for hours that night, Emily sitting in her car outside his garage, both of them too overwhelmed to move, too afraid that hanging up might somehow undo the miracle of finally hearing each other's voices again. Daniel did not ask about the years of silence with anger or blame. He simply listened as Emily, through tears, apologized for believing lies she had been too young and too manipulated to see through. He told her the same thing he had written in every unread letter, that none of it had ever been her fault, that a child could not be blamed for believing the adults entrusted with protecting her. The truth about Diane's manipulation eventually came to light publicly when Emily, now determined to make things right, worked with a lawyer to formally investigate the misappropriated trust funds. Faced with undeniable financial records and Emily's testimony, Diane was ordered to repay the misused funds and lost the guardianship credibility she had spent years cultivating within extended family circles. More painful for Diane than any legal consequence was watching Emily choose, without hesitation, to walk away from the polished life she had built and toward the modest, grease-stained world of a father who had never stopped loving her. The courtroom hearing where the truth was finally laid bare was nothing like the dramatic confrontations Emily had once imagined in the months leading up to it. It was quiet, procedural, almost anticlimactic. A room full of tired fluorescent lighting, and a judge who had seen 1,000 family disputes before this one. Yet for Emily, sitting in the gallery beside her father for the first time in over a decade, it felt like the final chapter of a war that had silently raged for 11 years. Diane's lawyer tried to argue that the withdrawn funds had been used responsibly for Emily's upbringing, but the paper trail told a different story, one of home renovations and boutiques and a leased luxury vehicle that had nothing to do with tuition or school supplies. When the judge read the ruling ordering repayment and formally acknowledging the irregularities in the original custody proceedings, Daniel did not smile or celebrate. He simply reached over and took Emily's hand, the way he used to when she was small and afraid of thunderstorms, and Emily, for the first time since she was a child, let him. Outside the courthouse, Diane approached them one last time, her composure cracking for the first time Emily could ever remember. She tried to explain herself, muttering something about only wanting to give Emily a better life, about Daniel never being enough, about doing what she believed Rachel would have wanted. Emily listened quietly, feeling none of the fear that had once kept her silent for so many years, and when Diane finally finished, Emily simply said that her mother would never have wanted a lie to raise her daughter, no matter how comfortable the lie looked from the outside. She turned and walked away, her father's hand still resting gently on her shoulder, leaving Diane standing alone on the courthouse steps with nothing left to control. Emily moved back to her hometown shortly after graduating, taking a job at a small local newspaper while slowly rebuilding the relationship with her father that Diane had spent over a decade trying to destroy. The process was not instant or perfectly smooth. There were nights when old wounds resurfaced, moments when Emily struggled with guilt over the years she had spent believing the worst about a man who deserved none of it. But Daniel, patient as he'd always been, never once made her feel rushed. He simply showed up day after day the same way he always had, proving through consistent action what words alone could never fully repair. There were awkward dinners in the beginning, long silences at the small kitchen table where Daniel had once helped a much younger Emily with her homework, both of them unsure how to fill 11 years of missing conversation. Emily would catch herself studying her father's face, searching for the stranger Diane had described, and finding instead only tired eyes that lit up every single time she walked through the door. Daniel, in turn, had to relearn his daughter as the woman she had become rather than the child he had lost, careful not to overwhelm her with the flood of love he had been holding back for over a decade. Slowly, through shared meals, quiet car rides, and Sunday afternoons spent teaching Emily how to change a tire in the same garage where he had once wept alone after closing time, the distance between them began to shrink. One evening, several months into their reconciliation, Emily finally worked up the courage to ask her father the question that had haunted her since she first found the letters: why he had never simply forced the issue, hired an aggressive lawyer, or fought Diane in the media the way another man might have. Daniel considered the question for a long moment before answering that he had been terrified of becoming, in Emily's eyes, exactly the manipulative, controlling man Diane always claimed he was. He explained that he had chosen instead to trust that the truth, given enough time, would eventually find her, even if it meant enduring years of silence that nearly broke him. It was a kind of quiet, deliberate restraint that Emily would later say taught her more about real love than anything she had learned in her entire childhood. On the anniversary of Rachel's passing, exactly 1 year after that first phone call in the garage parking lot, Emily surprised her father by organizing a small gathering at the local children's hospital where he had quietly donated for years. Standing beside him as he cut the ribbon for a small reading corner dedicated in her mother's memory, Emily finally understood the full weight of everything her father had sacrificed in silence, without recognition, without her knowledge, simply because it was the right thing to do. That evening, sitting on the same porch where he used to read her dinosaur books as a little girl, Daniel pulled out the old digital recorder he had used for over a decade, pressing play on the very first message he had recorded the week Emily blocked his number. Emily listened, tears falling freely, as her father's younger, more exhausted voice spoke gently into the recording, promising an 8-year-old version of her that, no matter how long it took, no matter how far apart they became, he would never, ever stop being her father. He played a second recording, then a third, each one dated months apart across the 11 lost years. A strange and beautiful timeline of a man growing older while his hope somehow never did. In one recording, his voice cracked as he described her 7th grade graduation, an event he had learned about only through a mutual friend and had watched from a distance across the parking lot, too afraid of causing a scene to walk any closer. In another, recorded on what would have been her 16th birthday, he simply sang the same off-key happy birthday song he used to sing every year, alone in his truck, refusing to let the tradition die simply because she could not hear it. Emily asked him through tears how he had found the strength to keep recording messages to someone who, for all he knew, might never listen to a single one. Daniel thought about the question for a long moment before answering that hope, real hope, was never really about certainty. It was about choosing, again and again, to believe in a future you could not yet see, simply because the alternative, giving up entirely, was a kind of loss he was never willing to accept. Emily leaned her head against her father's shoulder, the way she used to as a little girl, and for the first time in 11 years, the silence between them felt peaceful instead of painful. Word of what had happened eventually reached the small community they lived in, not through gossip, but through Emily herself, who wrote a quiet, deeply personal article for the local newspaper about the power of persistence and the danger of letting a single voice control an entire narrative. She never named Diane directly, choosing instead to focus on her father's decade of silent devotion. The weekly letters, the recorded voice messages, the untouched trust fund he had personally supplemented from his own modest wages whenever he feared it might run short for her future. The article struck a nerve far beyond their small town, shared thousands of times by strangers who recognized fragments of their own broken families within its lines. Each comment beneath the story a small testament to how many people out there were still waiting for their own version of that phone call. Daniel never read the article himself, uncomfortable with the attention, but he kept a printed copy folded inside his wallet, taking it out occasionally to reread the final line Emily had written, the line that said, "Sometimes the loudest love is the kind that says nothing at all and simply waits." Neighbors who had known Daniel for years, who had watched him raise Emily alone before the separation, and continue working quietly through the years of silence that followed, began greeting him with a new kind of respect. Not pity, but genuine admiration for a man who had never once used his daughter's absence as an excuse to give up on being her father. In the end, this story is not simply about betrayal or the pain of being separated from someone you love. It is about the quiet, unglamorous power of patience and unconditional love that refuses to expire even when silence stretches for over a decade. It is a reminder that truth, no matter how deeply buried under manipulation and lies, eventually finds its way to the surface. And that sometimes the people who love us the most are the ones who wait the longest without ever asking for anything in return. Somewhere out there tonight, someone is holding on to a version of hope that looks a lot like Daniel's wooden box of unopened letters or his old digital recorder full of unheard birthday songs. And if this story tells us anything, it is that such hope is never wasted, no matter how many years pass in silence. If this story moved you even a little, remember to like this video, subscribe for more emotional stories like this one, and share it with someone who might need a reminder today that it is never truly too late to pick up the phone and finally listen.